This is the story of the Dutch Empire, a maritime power born from rebellion, trade and tenacity, whose sails once touched every corner of the globe. Welcome to Fall Asleep Too. If long, gentle journeys through history, philosophy and the stars bring you comfort, consider subscribing so you'll always have another story waiting. Now get comfortable, let the world grow quiet, and let's get started. The Netherlands, as we know it today, began not with empires or glory, but with water, wind and resilience. Nestled in the northwest of Europe, the land was flat, often marshy, and constantly threatened by the sea. For centuries, the people of these lowlands battled the elements as much as any invading army. And perhaps it was this very challenge, the need to survive in a precarious landscape, that shaped the indomitable spirit of the Dutch. By the late Middle Ages, the region now known as the Netherlands was part of a collection of provinces under the control of the mighty Habsburg Empire, ruled by the Spanish crown. These provinces were culturally diverse, linguistically varied, and economically vibrant, especially the cities of Antwerp, Amsterdam, and Rotterdam. The Low Countries were wealthy not because of conquest, but because of trade, with their rivers and access to the North Sea, making them a commercial hub in Northern Europe. But beneath this wealth and activity, tensions simmered. The people of the Netherlands were fiercely independent, and the growing power of the Spanish monarchy, especially under King Philip II, threatened their way of life. Along with political control came religious imposition. The Protestant Reformation had found fertile ground in the north, while Spain remained staunchly Catholic. This divide would lead to one of the most transformative conflicts in European history, the 80 Years' War. It was not a war of armies clashing on vast battlefields, but one of sieges, revolts, and resistance. The Dutch, led by William of Orange, often called William the Silent, began their long struggle for independence in the late 16th century. They were outnumbered, outfunded, and facing the might of a global empire. But they had something else, an extraordinary ability to organize, to innovate, and above all, to persevere. The struggle was not just about religion or taxes, it was about identity, about whether the people of the Low Countries would be subjects of a distant empire or masters of their own fate, and in time, through blood and resistance, they would emerge victorious. By 1581, the northern provinces declared their independence from Spain with the Act of Abjuration, a document that some historians see as a precursor to the American Declaration of Independence nearly 2 centuries later. It stated that the king had failed his people, and therefore the people were no longer bound to serve him. The war would continue for decades after that declaration, but the die had been cast. A new republic was forming, one not ruled by a monarch, but by a group of provinces united in mutual interest. And this republic, the Dutch Republic, would soon astonish the world. With independence slowly taking root, the Dutch began to turn outward. The Iberian powers, Spain and Portugal, had already established empires in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. But the Dutch, with their growing merchant fleets and their unique talent for navigation and shipbuilding, saw an opportunity. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or VOC, was founded. It wasn't just a trading company. It was the world's first multinational corporation, and perhaps the most powerful private entity in history. The VOC could wage war, negotiate treaties, mint currency, and govern territories. Its creation marked the beginning of the Dutch Golden Age, a time when a small republic of seafarers would rise to challenge the great empires of the world. Amsterdam, once a modest fishing town, rapidly transformed into the beating heart of global commerce. Its canals mirrored the arteries of the sea, carrying goods, ideas, and people to and from every continent. The Dutch traded in spices, textiles, sugar, tea, porcelain, and silver. They established colonies in the East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, and set up outposts in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, India, and even Japan. In the West, they colonized parts of the Caribbean, founded New Amsterdam in North America, which would later become New York City, and took control of parts of Brazil and the Guianas. They were not the largest empire, nor the most brutal, but they were among the most efficient. Their merchant ships outnumbered those of all other nations combined. They understood the winds, the currents, and the markets. They knew how to profit and how to endure. But theirs was not just a story of trade, it was also a story of art, science, and ideas. The 17th century saw the flowering of Dutch culture. Rembrandt painted faces that seemed to gaze back across the centuries. Vermeer captured moments of quiet beauty and light. Spinoza questioned the very nature of God and existence, while Leeuwenhoek peered into a world invisible to the naked eye, discovering microorganisms with his handcrafted lenses. This was the Dutch Golden Age, not just of empire, but of intellect. The world was growing wider, deeper, more connected, and at the centre of it, steering through uncharted waters, was the Dutch Republic. But every empire has its costs and its contradictions. The same ships that brought silk and nutmeg also carried enslaved people. The same maps that charted coastlines also erased indigenous names and histories. And though the Dutch championed religious tolerance at home, they imposed their rule by force abroad. Still, for a time, they seemed unstoppable. The VOC was so profitable that it made its shareholders wealthy beyond imagination. The Dutch built dikes and windmills to tame the sea at home, and forts and ports to command the oceans abroad. They had no king, no vast army, no grand palaces, but they had ships and sails and purpose. And so the Dutch Empire expanded, not with the roar of cannon alone, but with the rustle of sails and the quiet signing of contracts. It was an empire built on trade, and it would shape the world in ways that still echo today. As we continue this journey, we'll explore the rise and reach of this maritime empire, its victories and its defeats, its innovations and its contradictions. From Java to Suriname, from the Cape of Good Hope to the banks of the Hudson River, the Dutch left their mark. The formation of the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, in 1602 was a defining moment in world history. While Portugal had already established a foothold in the Indian Ocean trade network, the Dutch brought with them a unique combination of naval strength, commercial pragmatism, and corporate structure. The VOC was granted a monopoly by the States General of the Dutch Republic over all trade in Asia, stretching from the Cape of Good Hope to the Strait of Magellan. It became the world's first joint stock company with publicly tradable shares, setting the stage for modern capitalism. The Dutch quickly began to challenge Portuguese dominance in the spice trade, particularly in the East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. Spices like cloves, nutmeg, and mace were highly prized in Europe, not only for flavouring food, but also for preserving it. These commodities, once worth more than gold by weight, were largely confined to a few islands in Southeast Asia, the Banda Islands and the Moluccas, also known as the Spice Islands. The VOC established trading posts or factories in key strategic locations such as Ambon, Banda, and Ternate. In 1619, they founded Batavia on the island of Java, which would serve as the administrative and commercial centre of Dutch activities in Asia. Batavia, now Jakarta, became the capital of the Dutch East Indies and the heart of their Asian empire. Control was often established through a mix of diplomacy, alliances, and military force. The Dutch used their advanced naval technology and superior organisation to push out the Portuguese, especially from key ports like Malacca and Ceylon. However, the acquisition of the Banda Islands was marked by violence. In 1621, after facing resistance from the local population, the VOC carried out a brutal massacre and deportation campaign that effectively depopulated the islands. The Dutch then repopulated them with slaves and set up nutmeg plantations under direct company control. The VOC's power lay not just in its military capabilities, but in its logistical and administrative efficiency. It maintained a vast network of ships, warehouses, and officials across the Indian Ocean, from the Persian Gulf to Japan. The company established a presence in Persia, the Coromandel coast of India, Bengal, Siam, modern-day Thailand, and eventually Japan, where it operated out of the man-made island of Dejima in Nagasaki Bay. The Dutch were the only Europeans allowed to trade directly with the Japanese during the Edo period due to their willingness to abide by local regulations and their focus on commerce rather than religion. Unlike the Portuguese and Spanish, the Dutch did not attempt to convert local populations to Christianity, a decision that helped them gain the trust of the Tokugawa shogunate. In Ceylon, the Dutch initially allied with local kingdoms to oust the Portuguese, but gradually took over key territories themselves, including Colombo and the coastal areas. They introduced administrative reforms and sought to monopolize the lucrative cinnamon trade. Further east, the Dutch expanded into Taiwan, which they ruled from 1624 to 1662, establishing a short-lived colony that served both as a trading base and a point of contact with China and Japan. The VOC also made forays into Vietnam and Cambodia, though with less success. Throughout the 17th century, the VOC became a major player in the Asian trading world, controlling key choke points and profiting from a wide array of commodities. Textiles from India, tea from China, tin from Malaya, and spices from the East Indies. Dutch ships regularly travelled the route from Batavia to Amsterdam, bringing immense wealth back to the Republic. This wealth helped fuel the Dutch Golden Age, not just in art and science, but in banking, finance, and urban development. Amsterdam became the financial capital of Europe, home to the first stock exchange and a flourishing merchant class. However, the VOC's success came at a cost. The company's activities were marked by exploitative labour practices, including the extensive use of enslaved people in its plantations and warehouses. Local economies were reshaped to serve the needs of distant markets, and resistance was often met with repression. Despite this, the VOC stood as a symbol of the Dutch Republic's maritime might. By the mid-17th century, it employed tens of thousands of people, operated hundreds of ships, and generated enormous profits. It functioned as a state within a state with its own armies, diplomats, and governance structures. At the same time, the Dutch West India Company, founded in 1621, began to carry out similar operations in the Atlantic world. Together, these two companies extended the reach of the Dutch Empire to nearly every ocean. As we move forward, the story will shift from Asia to the Americas, where Dutch ambitions would clash with both European rivals and indigenous peoples. The empire was global in scope, a network of ports and colonies tied together by trade winds, contracts, and shifting alliances. In the 17th century, the Netherlands stood at the height of its power. But even in this golden era, seeds of competition and conflict were being sown, with the English, with the Portuguese, and within the Dutch system itself. While the Dutch East India Company commanded the eastern seas, the Dutch West India Company, known as the WIC, focused on the Atlantic. Established in 1621, the WIC was tasked with expanding Dutch commercial and territorial interests in the Americas and along the coasts of West Africa. Like the VOC, it was a chartered company with military and political authority, empowered to wage war, sign treaties, and govern colonies. One of the WIC's first major initiatives was to challenge the Portuguese and Spanish in Brazil. At the time, much of northeastern Brazil was under Portuguese control, and it was a key centre of sugar production, one of the most lucrative commodities in the Atlantic trade. In 1630, the Dutch launched a successful campaign to seize large portions of this territory, establishing Dutch Brazil, or New Holland, with its capital in Recife. The Dutch administration in Brazil was notable for its relative tolerance and attempts at multicultural governance. Johan Maurits of Nassau, who governed from 1637 to 1644, brought artists, scientists and engineers with him, turning Recife into a thriving centre of Dutch colonial life. The colony allowed freedom of religion, rare at the time, and welcomed Jews, Protestants and Catholics alike. Dutch cartographers mapped the region, and painters documented Brazilian landscapes and people in great detail. However, this experiment in colonial pluralism was short-lived. The Portuguese population, supported by the Catholic Church and local allies, resisted Dutch rule. Over time, guerrilla warfare eroded Dutch control, and by 1654, after a series of battles and revolts, the Portuguese had regained most of the territory. Dutch Brazil was over. In North America, the Dutch founded one of their most enduring colonies, New Netherland. Established in 1624, it stretched from the Delaware River in the south to the Hudson River in the north. At the centre of this colony was New Amsterdam, located on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. New Amsterdam was a trading hub rather than a settler colony. The Dutch approach to colonization often emphasized commerce over conquest. The city was diverse from the start, home to Dutch, German, Scandinavian, Jewish, and African inhabitants. Religious freedom, though limited, was greater than in many European settlements of the time. The Dutch maintained good relations with some indigenous groups, especially those who could serve as trading partners in the fur trade. However, conflict still arose. Tensions with the Lenape people led to a series of violent confrontations in the 1640s, known as Kieft's War, named after director Willem Kieft. These events highlighted the fragile and often exploitative relationships between colonizers and native peoples. In 1664, the English seized New Amsterdam without firing a shot, renaming it New York in honor of the Duke of York. Though the Dutch briefly recaptured it in 1673, they returned it to the English the following year under the Treaty of Westminster. Despite its short life, New Netherland left a lasting cultural and architectural imprint, particularly in the Hudson Valley. Elsewhere in the Americas, the Dutch established colonies and trading posts in the Caribbean. They captured Curaçao in 1634, Aruba in 1636, and Bonaire shortly thereafter. These islands, collectively known as the A, B, C Islands, became important centres for trade and privateering. Dutch ships harboured in these ports often raided Spanish treasure fleets and coastal towns. In the Guianas, the Dutch established colonies in Suriname, Berbice, and Essequibo. These colonies developed into plantation economies reliant on enslaved labour. Sugar, coffee, and cotton became major exports, and the transatlantic slave trade supplied the labour needed to fuel production. To support these ventures, the WIC operated slave trading posts along the West African coast. Fort Elmina in present-day Ghana became a central hub. Here, enslaved Africans were bought, held in dungeons, and loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. The Dutch played a significant role in the transatlantic slave trade, transporting hundreds of thousands of Africans across the Middle Passage. This legacy remains one of the darkest chapters of the Dutch Empire. The triangular trade, involving goods from Europe, enslaved people from Africa, and commodities from the Americas, was central to Dutch wealth in the Atlantic. Sugar from Suriname, salt from Curaçao, and furs from New Netherland all enriched the Republic. Despite these gains, the Dutch faced constant rivalry. The Spanish and the Portuguese resisted Dutch encroachment in Latin America, while the English challenged their holdings in North America and the Caribbean. Naval battles and colonial skirmishes were common, as were shifting alliances and treaties. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 recognised Dutch independence from Spain, solidifying the Republic's place among European powers. Yet even as the Dutch expanded their overseas empire, the competition grew fiercer. The English Navigation Acts, passed in the 1650s, sought to limit Dutch access to English colonial markets. These acts would contribute to a series of naval conflicts between the two powers, the Anglo-Dutch Wars. As the 17th century progressed, the Dutch Empire had established itself across 4 continents. It was a decentralized network rather than a unified realm, driven by commerce and corporate power. The VOC ruled in the east, the WIC in the west. But while profits soared, so did the costs: military, moral, and human. The Dutch model of empire was innovative, efficient, and in many ways modern. But it was also built on exploitation, conquest, and inequality. The wealth of Amsterdam was mirrored by the suffering in Batavia, Elmina, and Paramaribo. Still, the Dutch held a unique position in the early modern world. With a small population and limited land, they had projected their influence across oceans through trade, diplomacy, and maritime skill. By the mid-17th century, the Dutch Republic had become the foremost maritime and commercial power in Europe. Its fleets crisscrossed the globe, its ports were filled with exotic goods, and its banking and financial systems had become the envy of other nations. But with success came rivals, most notably England. The Dutch and the English were both Protestant powers and had once been allies against Catholic Spain. But as their commercial interests expanded, they found themselves increasingly in direct competition. Both sought control over the same trade routes, access to the same colonial markets, and dominance at sea. Their rivalry was as much economic as it was naval. This tension culminated in a series of 3 naval wars fought between 1652 and 1674, known collectively as the Anglo-Dutch Wars. The First Anglo-Dutch War began in 1652 during the English Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. The English Parliament passed the Navigation Acts in 1651, which required that all goods imported into England or its colonies be transported on English ships or on ships from the country of origin. This was a direct blow to Dutch merchants, who dominated the carrying trade of Europe. Skirmishes between Dutch and English ships quickly escalated into full-scale naval conflict. The English Navy, reorganised and modernised under Cromwell, won several key engagements, including the Battle of the Gabbard and the Battle of Scheveningen. The Dutch, led by Admiral Martin Tromp, resisted fiercely, but after his death and a string of defeats, the war ended in 1654 with the Treaty of Westminster. The Second Anglo-Dutch War, 1665 to 1667, was fought during the reign of King Charles II of England. Unlike the first conflict, this war saw significant Dutch victories, particularly at sea. The Dutch Navy, under the command of Admiral Michiel de Ruyter, became a symbol of national pride and resilience. One of the most remarkable events of this war was the raid on the Medway in 1667. In that daring operation, Dutch warships sailed up the River Medway in southeastern England and attacked the English fleet at anchor. They burned or captured several ships, including the flagship Royal Charles, which was towed back to the Netherlands as a trophy. The raid shocked the English public and contributed to a quick end to the war. The Treaty of Breda favoured the Dutch, confirming their control of valuable colonies such as Suriname. However, this success would be challenged during the Third Anglo-Dutch War, 1672 to 1674. Part of a broader European conflict known in the Netherlands as the Rampjaar, or Disaster Year. In 1672, the Dutch Republic was invaded on multiple fronts, by France from the south, by England at sea, and by the bishoprics of Münster and Cologne from the east. The war was devastating. France, under Louis XIV, sought to destroy the Dutch Republic entirely. The English navy resumed hostilities, and the situation looked dire. Yet the Dutch, through strategic flooding of their own land and fierce naval resistance, managed to halt the French advance. Admiral de Ruyter once again played a pivotal role, engaging the Anglo-French fleet in several key battles, including the Battle of Solebay and the battles of Schooneveld. Though the Dutch lost ground on land, their control of the seas allowed them to survive. By 1674, peace was negotiated with England, and the Republic endured. These wars tested the strength and unity of the Dutch Republic. They also highlighted the vulnerability of a maritime empire that depended heavily on trade. While the Dutch navy remained formidable, the English were gaining ground, both economically and militarily. Beyond the battlefield, the Dutch continued to develop their commercial infrastructure. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the first of its kind, flourished. Innovations in banking, insurance, and shipping created a resilient financial system. Dutch shipyards built thousands of vessels, and their merchant fleet remained the largest in the world. Despite the toll of war, the late 17th century still marked a period of Dutch cultural and scientific achievement. The Republic was home to prominent thinkers like Christian Huygens, a physicist and astronomer, and Baruch Spinoza, whose writings on ethics and religion influenced Enlightenment thought. Trade remained the cornerstone of Dutch power. The VOC continued to bring spices, textiles and tea from the East Indies. The WIC, though less successful, maintained its colonies in the Caribbean and South America. Dutch merchants were deeply involved in the Atlantic slave trade, transporting enslaved Africans to plantations in Suriname and the Caribbean. The Dutch were also active in the Arctic, whaling in the seas around Spitsbergen and trading furs in Russia. Their global presence was unrivaled in scale, even if their hold on specific territories was less permanent than those of other empires. However, the balance was beginning to shift. England's economy was growing rapidly, and its navy was becoming larger and more professional. France under Louis XIV was expanding territorially and militarily. The Dutch found themselves increasingly caught between two larger powers. Still, the resilience of the Dutch during these wars, particularly their ability to defend their maritime interests, speaks to the depth of their naval tradition. The names of de Ruyter, Tromp and others became part of the national consciousness. The Anglo-Dutch Wars were not just military contests, they were competitions over control of the seas, trade routes and colonial markets. They marked the beginning of the end of unchallenged Dutch dominance, but not the end of Dutch ambition. Even as the Republic entered a more defensive posture in Europe, it maintained its vast overseas empire. The VOC and WIC continued their operations, and Dutch cities remained among the richest and most cosmopolitan in the world. The next decades would see changes in power, in competition, and in the global order. But the legacy of Dutch maritime power would endure. By the beginning of the 18th century, the Dutch Empire had reached a stage of maturity. The Dutch Republic remained a wealthy and influential power in global trade, its colonial presence established in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. But beneath this success lay signs of structural fatigue, particularly within its most powerful engine, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC. The VOC's holdings in Asia were vast. Batavia, on the island of Java, functioned as the administrative centre. From there, company officials oversaw a network of outposts stretching from Ceylon and the Malabar coast of India to the Moluccas, the Chinese coast, and Nagasaki Bay in Japan. The VOC had effectively monopolised the spice trade in Southeast Asia, controlling the production and distribution of cloves, nutmeg, and mace. Beyond spices, the company expanded into textiles, tea, coffee, and porcelain. It dealt with the Qing dynasty in China, purchased tea and silk, and sold it in Europe at high profit. Dutch ships visited Canton regularly, following strict Chinese regulations. In Japan, the VOC maintained its exclusive trading position at Dejima, the only European contact permitted during Japan's period of isolation, or sakoku. While trade remained profitable, the structure of the VOC was beginning to show signs of dysfunction. The company's decentralized governance system, which had once allowed flexibility in regional decision-making, now led to corruption, inefficiency, and poor coordination. Local administrators often acted in their own interests, and oversight from Amsterdam was slow and inadequate. In addition, military expenditures to defend VOC outposts from both indigenous resistance and European rivals were growing. Maintaining forts, garrisons, and fleets consumed large portions of company revenue. Wars in Europe further strained resources. The VOC's capital expenditures rose, while its profits began to decline. By the early 18th century, internal accounting at the VOC became increasingly unreliable. The company was borrowing to pay dividends, masking losses and undermining long-term sustainability. Although individual shareholders continued to receive payouts, the company itself was slipping into debt. Meanwhile, in the colonies, conditions were deteriorating. In Java, the Dutch had gradually moved from coastal trade posts to direct territorial rule. This shift led to increased conflict with local kingdoms and populations. In 1740, a major uprising in Batavia resulted in the massacre of thousands of Chinese residents, revealing deep ethnic and social tensions in the colony. The Dutch were forced to militarize their rule, leading to a more extractive and authoritarian form of governance. The decline of the VOC was also tied to changes in global trade. New competitors had emerged. The British East India Company had grown in strength, particularly after the British victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, which marked the beginning of formal British control over large parts of India. French and Danish trading companies also became more active, though the British would ultimately dominate. In the Atlantic world, Dutch holdings remained important but secondary to those of Britain, France, and Spain. The sugar plantations in Suriname and the Caribbean islands of Curaçao, Aruba, and Bonaire continued to generate wealth, but only through the intensive use of enslaved labour. The Dutch remained deeply involved in the transatlantic slave trade throughout the 18th century. The WIC, the Dutch West India Company, had already been dissolved in 1674 due to poor management and military failures. It was revived in a limited form, but never regained its previous influence. The colonies it had established, particularly Suriname and the ABC Islands, were transferred to direct state control. Despite the fading influence of the companies, the Dutch Republic itself remained a financial powerhouse. Amsterdam continued to be a major centre of international banking and credit. Dutch investors financed wars, businesses, and infrastructure across Europe. Dutch engineers helped build canals and dikes abroad. The intellectual legacy of the Golden Age, in science, philosophy, and art, persisted. But in terms of global dominance, the Dutch position was slipping. Britain was rising, both economically and militarily. The Royal Navy was expanding. British merchants were capturing market share in Asia, and British industrialization was beginning to reshape global production and consumption. In 1795, amid political upheaval in Europe, the VOC was formally dissolved. Its debts were too great, its operations too inefficient, and its model of governance outdated. The Dutch state absorbed its assets and liabilities. The Dutch East Indies, centred in Java, became a crown colony, managed directly by the government of the Batavian Republic, a French-aligned successor to the Dutch Republic. The dissolution of the VOC marked the end of a commercial experiment that had lasted nearly 2 centuries. It had transformed global trade, pioneered new corporate structures, and left an indelible mark on regions across Asia. But it had also been an engine of colonial violence, exploitation, and economic extraction. Even as the VOC fell, the Dutch Empire itself endured. The Dutch continued to control territories in Asia and the Caribbean. Their focus would now shift toward managing those possessions as formal colonies, especially in the East Indies. The transition from a company-run empire to a state-run colonial system would define the next phase of Dutch imperial history. With the dissolution of the Dutch East India Company in 1799, the governance of its Asian holdings transitioned from a chartered commercial enterprise to the direct control of the Dutch state. This marked the beginning of a new era in Dutch colonial history, one characterized not by mercantile ambition, but by formal imperial administration. The most important of these territories was Java, the centerpiece of what would become the Dutch East Indies. Java had long been the administrative heart of VOC operations. Now, under government rule, it evolved into the core of a colonial empire that would eventually encompass the modern territory of Indonesia. In the early 19th century, the Dutch Republic itself faced enormous changes. The French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars upended the European order. In 1795, the Netherlands became the Batavian Republic, a client state of a revolutionary France. Later, it was renamed the Kingdom of Holland under Napoleon's brother Louis Bonaparte, before being annexed directly into the French Empire. During this period of upheaval, Dutch overseas colonies became vulnerable. In 1811, British forces under Sir Stamford Raffles invaded Java and occupied it. The British controlled the island for 5 years, instituting reforms that included land tax systems and early studies of Javanese culture and history. Raffles is often credited with encouraging the preservation of monuments like Borobudur, a Buddhist temple complex that had been neglected for centuries. After Napoleon's defeat in the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Dutch sovereignty was restored. The Kingdom of the Netherlands was created, and in 1816, Java and other territories were handed back to Dutch control. From this point onward, the East Indies were administered not by a company, but as a formal colony. The 19th century witnessed the consolidation and expansion of Dutch rule across the Indonesian archipelago. While the VOC had focused on trade and control of specific ports and regions, the Dutch colonial state sought to extend its authority inland and across the outer islands. This expansion often came through military conquest and suppression of resistance. One of the most prolonged and costly conflicts was the Java War, 1825 to 1830, led by the Javanese prince, Diponegoro. The war arose from a combination of political, economic, and religious grievances, particularly the Dutch interference in traditional Javanese leadership and land use. It lasted 5 years and resulted in the deaths of over 200,000 people, including both combatants and civilians. Diponegoro was eventually captured and exiled to Makassar, but he remained a symbol of resistance in Indonesian memory. In the aftermath of the Java War, the Dutch established tighter administrative control and developed new revenue systems. Chief among these was the cultivation system, or cultuurstelsel, introduced in the 1830s by Governor-General Johannes van den Bosch. Under this system, Javanese peasants were required to allocate a portion of their land and labour to grow export crops such as sugar, coffee, indigo, and tobacco for the benefit of the colonial state. The cultivation system generated immense profits for the Netherlands. The colony became self-sustaining, and surplus revenues were funneled into the Dutch treasury. This era, often referred to in the Netherlands as the batik slot, positive balance, allowed the Dutch government to fund domestic infrastructure and pay down debts, essentially using colonial surplus to finance metropolitan development. But the system imposed heavy burdens on the Javanese population. Forced labour, land deprivation and famine became recurring problems. While Dutch officials often claimed that it was a form of development or modernisation, in reality it was a coercive extraction of resources and labour. The humanitarian consequences of the cultivation system drew criticism both in the colony and in the Netherlands. In 1860, the publication of the novel Max Havelaar by Eduard Doves Dekker, writing under the pseudonym Multatuli, exposed the abuses of the system to a wide European audience. The novel, which depicted the exploitation of Javanese villagers by corrupt colonial officials, sparked debate and is now considered a landmark in anti-colonial literature. As public opinion shifted and liberal economic policies gained favour, the cultivation system was gradually dismantled in the 1870s. It was replaced by private enterprise and cash crop plantations owned by European settlers and investors. While this system ended state monopolies, it did little to improve the conditions of indigenous labourers, who now worked for private employers under similarly harsh conditions. Meanwhile, the Dutch continued to expand their control over other parts of the archipelago. In Sumatra, the Dutch waged a protracted conflict known as the Aceh War, 1873 to 1904, one of the longest colonial wars in Southeast Asian history. The Kingdom of Aceh, located in the northern part of the island, fiercely resisted Dutch conquest. The war involved brutal counter-insurgency tactics and caused significant casualties. Aceh was eventually subdued, but guerrilla resistance continued for years. In Borneo, Sulawesi, and the Moluccas, Dutch officials signed treaties with local rulers or imposed rule through military force. By the early 20th century, the entire Indonesian archipelago had been brought under Dutch control, creating a unified but deeply fragmented colonial state. The Dutch colonial administration was hierarchical and paternalistic. Europeans held the highest positions, followed by foreign Asians, particularly Chinese, and at the bottom were indigenous Indonesians. Education was limited, primarily aimed at producing clerks and administrators to assist colonial governance. Political participation was non-existent for the vast majority of the native population. Despite this rigid structure, the 19th century also saw the beginnings of indigenous social and political change. Western education, Christianity, Islam, and nationalism began to shape new ideas among Indonesians. The seeds of future resistance were being planted, though they would not fully bloom until the 20th century. By the end of the 1800s, the Dutch East Indies was one of the most profitable colonies in the world. It provided raw materials for European industry, markets for European goods, and strategic control of sea routes through the Indonesian archipelago. But it was also an empire of contradictions. Technologically advanced, yet socially repressive, economically prosperous, yet built on forced labour and racial inequality. The Dutch had moved from trading posts to full colonial rule, transforming both Indonesia and the Netherlands in the process. This transformation was far from complete. The 20th century would bring new challenges: rising nationalism, global wars, and the eventual collapse of colonial empires. The beginning of the 20th century marked a shift in the tone and tenor of Dutch colonial rule. After centuries of mercantile dominance and territorial expansion, the Dutch Empire entered a period of reform, contested authority, and growing indigenous resistance, particularly in the Dutch East Indies. In the early 1900s, a new philosophy began to emerge within the colonial administration: the ethical policy, ethische Politik. This approach was shaped by liberal thinkers and colonial officials who believed that the Netherlands had a moral obligation to improve the welfare of its colonial subjects, an idea partially influenced by public outrage over past abuses, such as those described in Max Havelaar. The ethical policy aimed to provide better education, healthcare, and economic development in the Dutch East Indies. It also sought to foster an indigenous elite who could assist in governance. New schools were built, agricultural extension programs were introduced, and infrastructure projects expanded. However, the ethical policy was paternalistic in nature. It emphasized uplift without providing political power or autonomy. Indigenous Indonesians remained excluded from meaningful participation in government, and social hierarchies persisted. While the reforms had limited success in improving living conditions, they had an unintended consequence. They created a generation of Indonesians who were literate, politically aware, and increasingly critical of colonial rule. The early 20th century saw the formation of the first Indonesian political organizations. In 1908, Budi Utomo was founded, a cultural and educational association that marked the beginning of modern Indonesian nationalism. In 1912, Sarekat Islam, originally a trade organization, evolved into a mass political movement advocating for greater rights for Muslims and Indonesians under Dutch rule. These movements were followed by more explicitly political organizations, including the Indonesian National Party, Partai Nasional Indonesia, founded by Sukarno in 1927. Sukarno, an eloquent speaker and Western-educated engineer, would become one of the central figures in the fight for Indonesian independence. The Dutch response to these movements was cautious. While some political activity was tolerated, radical or anti-colonial rhetoric was often met with arrest, censorship, or exile. Sukarno himself was imprisoned multiple times and exiled to remote islands. Nevertheless, nationalism continued to spread through education, publications, and youth organizations. Elsewhere in the empire, Dutch colonial holdings in the Caribbean and South America remained economically important but politically quiet. Suriname and the Netherlands Antilles, including Curaçao and Aruba, produced sugar, oil, and bauxite. These colonies were small and less central to Dutch identity than the East Indies, but they too would eventually push for autonomy in the post-war period. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 did not directly affect the Dutch Empire, as the Netherlands remained neutral. However, global economic disruption and rising commodity prices strained colonial economies. In the East Indies, food shortages and inflation led to unrest in rural areas, which was often suppressed by colonial police and military forces. The interwar period, from 1919 to 1939, saw both continued economic development and mounting political tension. Dutch oil companies like Royal Dutch Shell expanded operations in Sumatra and Borneo, profiting from the global rise in demand for petroleum. Meanwhile, Indonesian workers in plantations, factories, and ports began to organize strikes and unions. The Dutch authorities responded with a mixture of concessions and repression. While some infrastructure improvements and limited political reforms were introduced, key nationalist leaders remained under surveillance or imprisonment. The colonial system remained fundamentally authoritarian. This fragile balance was shattered in 1942, when Japan invaded the Dutch East Indies during World War II, the rapid Japanese conquest humiliated Dutch colonial forces and ended over 3 centuries of European rule, at least temporarily. The Japanese occupation, 1942 to 1945, was harsh. Forced labour, food shortages, and political repression affected millions. However, the occupation also undermined the authority of the Dutch colonial state. Japanese authorities promoted Indonesian nationalism as a tool for managing the population, allowing nationalist leaders like Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta to emerge in public political life. For many Indonesians, the war years were a moment of awakening. The myth of European invincibility had been shattered, and the possibility of self-rule now felt real. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Indonesian nationalists declared independence just 2 days later, on August 17, 1945. Sukarno and Hatta proclaimed the Republic of Indonesia, ushering in a new era of struggle. The Dutch, however, were not willing to relinquish their most valuable colony. After returning from exile and reasserting control over some parts of the archipelago, the Netherlands launched military campaigns to retake the East Indies, operations euphemistically termed police actions. These military interventions sparked global criticism and fierce Indonesian resistance. The Indonesian National Revolution, 1945 to 1949, was marked by brutal fighting, diplomatic maneuvering, and international pressure. The newly formed United Nations, as well as the United States, pushed the Netherlands to negotiate. In 1949, after 4 years of war and increasing international isolation, the Netherlands formally transferred sovereignty to the Republic of Indonesia, ending over 300 years of colonial rule. The loss of the East Indies marked the collapse of the Dutch Empire as a major colonial power. It was both a political and psychological turning point for the Netherlands. Indonesia had been the crown jewel of the empire, economically vital and deeply embedded in Dutch identity. Though Suriname and the Caribbean islands remained under Dutch control, the age of empire was over. The Netherlands, like other European powers, would now need to redefine its global role in a rapidly decolonizing world. The formal recognition of Indonesian independence in 1949 marked a watershed moment, not just for Indonesia, but for the Dutch Empire as a whole. While other colonies remained under Dutch control, the loss of the East Indies was decisive. It represented the end of Dutch global prominence and the beginning of a national reckoning over the legacy of colonialism. In the immediate aftermath of decolonization, thousands of Dutch citizens, Indo-Europeans, people of mixed Dutch and Indonesian descent, and loyal local allies, particularly the Moluccans, many of whom had served in the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, were repatriated or relocated to the Netherlands. This mass migration brought a sudden and dramatic demographic shift. Many of these newcomers struggled to integrate into Dutch society, facing discrimination and cultural dislocation. Among them, the South Moluccans hoped for political support for an independent republic in their homeland. When that support did not materialize, frustrations grew. This culminated decades later, in the 1970s, with a series of dramatic events in the Netherlands, including train hijackings and hostage crises, by second-generation Moluccans demanding attention to their cause. These events forced Dutch society to confront the long aftershocks of empire. Elsewhere, Dutch colonial holdings in the Caribbean and South America entered a new phase. Suriname, located on the northern coast of South America, had remained a plantation colony through the 19th century and into the 20th. After the abolition of slavery in 1863, the colony relied heavily on indentured labourers from British India and Java, many of whom settled permanently. Suriname became a multicultural society composed of Afro-Surinamese, Javanese Surinamese, Hindustani, Indian descendants, Maroons, descendants of escaped slaves, and indigenous peoples. For much of the 20th century, the Dutch government maintained tight control over its administration and economy, though internal political parties began to develop. After years of negotiation and growing nationalist sentiment, Suriname gained full independence from the Netherlands on November 25, 1975. This transition, unlike Indonesia's, was peaceful and relatively well organized. However, it was also marked by uncertainty. Tens of thousands of Surinamese citizens, unsure about the political and economic future of the new country, emigrated to the Netherlands, where they formed a substantial diaspora. Suriname experienced political instability shortly after independence, including military coups, authoritarian rule, and human rights abuses. Nevertheless, diplomatic ties with the Netherlands continued, and Dutch development aid played a significant role in the country's post-independence era. The Netherlands Antilles, a group of Caribbean islands including Curaçao, Bonaire, Aruba, Sint Maarten, Saba, and Sint Eustatius, remained part of the Dutch realm, albeit with increasing autonomy. These islands had long-standing economic ties to the Netherlands, especially through oil refining, tourism, and offshore finance. In 1954, the Netherlands Antilles, along with Suriname and the Netherlands itself, became constituent countries in the Kingdom of the Netherlands under a new constitutional arrangement. This status granted internal autonomy but maintained a shared monarchy and foreign policy framework. Aruba, seeking greater independence, separated from the Netherlands Antilles in 1986 and acquired its own status aparte while still remaining within the kingdom. Over time, this model became more appealing to the other islands as well. Eventually, in 2010, the Netherlands Antilles was officially dissolved. Curaçao and Sint Maarten became autonomous countries within the kingdom, like Aruba, while Bonaire, Saba, and Sint Eustatius became special municipalities of the Netherlands itself. Today, these Caribbean islands retain close ties with the Netherlands, though debates over autonomy, inequality, and identity continue. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, the process of confronting colonial legacies unfolded slowly and unevenly. For much of the post-war period, colonialism was either romanticized or overlooked in public discourse. School curricula downplayed the violence of colonial rule, and national narratives emphasized trade, tolerance, and civilizing missions over exploitation and resistance. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, however, new scholarship, activism, and political movements began to challenge these narratives. Calls for historical reckoning grew louder. The role of the Netherlands in the transatlantic slave trade, colonial violence in Indonesia, and the suppression of resistance movements came under increasing scrutiny. Museums, universities, and public institutions began to reassess their roles in promoting colonial ideology. The Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam initiated efforts to confront the colonial roots of many of its artifacts. Debates over monuments, language, and reparations emerged in both public and political spaces. Survivors of colonial conflicts, particularly from Indonesia and Suriname, shared their testimonies, while descendants of enslaved peoples and migrants advocated for recognition, justice, and inclusion. These efforts marked a cultural shift, from colonial pride to post-colonial reflection. Simultaneously, the former colonies themselves continued to grapple with the complex legacies of Dutch rule. In Indonesia, the colonial period is remembered both as an era of repression and a crucible for national identity. In Suriname and the Caribbean, memories of slavery, migration, and resistance shape cultural and political life. By the start of the 21st century, the Dutch Empire, once global and dominant, existed only in fragments of memory, diaspora, and institutional ties. The Kingdom of the Netherlands had become a more decentralized and pluralistic entity, with its Caribbean members maintaining distinct identities and relationships to the Dutch state. Though no longer an empire in the traditional sense, the consequences of centuries of colonialism continued to influence migration patterns, politics, social structures, and debates about national identity, both in the Netherlands and across its former territories. The Dutch Empire, once a web of ships, colonies, and trade routes that stretched across the world, no longer exists in its imperial form. But its legacy remains. It lives in the language, law, and architecture of places as diverse as Indonesia, Suriname, Curaçao, and South Africa. It endures in the global economy, shaped by centuries of Dutch innovation in finance, shipping, and trade. It lingers in cultural memory, in paintings of East Indiamen at sea, in Creole dialects, and in debates over monuments and historical justice. From a small European republic with limited land and resources, the Dutch forged a global presence through maritime ambition, corporate enterprise, and political pragmatism. Their empire was built on commerce, but also on conquest. It brought scientific exchange, but also slavery and exploitation. Today, the Netherlands continues to wrestle with this past through education, remembrance, and sometimes resistance. Former colonies have forged new identities, independent yet shaped by centuries of entanglement. The Dutch Empire has long since vanished from the maps, but its echoes still move quietly through the world in the flow of goods, people, and memory.